Is the food in there for people like me? Or is it just for the photographs? The question came from the doorway and it wasn't loud. It didn't have to be. 300 people in black tie heard it, because the violinist had reached the end of a phrase and had not yet started the next one. And into that half-second of silence the words fell like a dropped glass. At table 1, beneath a banner that read "No one deserves to go hungry" in 18-inch gold letters, Margaret Ashford set down her fork. She had been about to eat. That detail would stay with her later, when the lawyers came and the reporters came and the years she had wasted came, all of them at once. She had been about to eat a piece of beef tenderloin that cost more than a night in a shelter bed. At a gala she had founded, on a banner she had personally approved, and a woman standing in the rain outside her hotel had just asked whether any of it was real. The woman was maybe 30, soaked through. She wore a faded blue scrub top under a men's canvas jacket, and the scrub top had a name embroidered on the pocket that was too far away to read. Her hair was pulled back with a rubber band. In both arms she held a cardboard shoebox, tied shut with brown twine, held against her chest the way people hold things that have no other place to be. Behind her, propping the service door open with his shoulder, a young waiter stood frozen with a full tray of untouched beef. He had been carrying it to the bin. Margaret watched him look at the tray, then at the woman, then at the tray again, and understood that he had just seen his own job for the first time. Warren Croft reached the doorway before anyone else. He was the director of the foundation's events, a tall man who wore his lanyard like a badge of office, and he moved with the particular speed of someone who believes he is preventing a disaster rather than creating one. "Ma'am," he said, low and warm and absolutely without kindness, "you can't be in here." "I know," the woman said. That answer stopped him. Margaret saw it stop him. He had a script for arguing. He had no script for agreement. "I just wanted to ask," the woman said. Her voice shook, but it did not lower. "The sign says no one deserves to go hungry. I'm standing right here. So I wanted to know if the sign means anyone. Or if it means the idea of anyone." Somebody at table 4 laughed, not cruelly, nervously. It was the sound of a room deciding what it was allowed to feel. Warren Croft's hand closed around the woman's elbow. "Don't," Margaret said. She had not planned to say it. She had not planned anything. She had been sitting at her own table with her hands folded 40 minutes into an evening she had attended for 11 consecutive Decembers, and the word came out of her before she had located the reason for it. The room turned, 300 faces, and every one of them belonged to somebody who had written the foundation a check. Warren Croft let go. "Mrs. Ashford, I apologize. Security's on the way. Cancel them. Cancel it." Margaret pushed back her chair. She was 68 years old and 5'3" in the shoes she'd stopped enjoying 20 years ago, and she crossed that ballroom floor while 100 phones came out of 100 purses. Rain hammered the glass along the north wall. Somewhere behind her the violinist had given up entirely. Up close the woman was thinner than she'd looked from the table. Her lips had gone gray at the edges. The embroidery on her scrub pocket said R. Delaney HHC, and the stitching had come loose on the second L, so it read like a name that was slowly leaving her. "What's your name?" Margaret said. "Ruth Delaney." "Ruth, are you going to eat that beef if he throws it away?" Ruth Delaney looked at the tray. Then she looked back at Margaret with an expression that was not gratitude. It was something much harder to receive. "I've eaten worse," she said. "I'd rather not have to." Margaret turned to the waiter. He was perhaps 22. He was holding 40 pounds of ruined food and he looked like he wanted to disappear inside his own vest. "What's your name?" "Emiliano, Mom." "Emiliano, put that tray down and go get a chair, a good one. Bring it to my table." She looked at Warren Croft. "And bring Miss Delaney a plate, hot, whatever the kitchen is proudest of tonight, and a towel." Warren Croft's jaw worked. He leaned in so the room wouldn't hear. "Mrs. Ashford, with respect, there are donors here, there are photographers here. Some of our guests may not feel comfortable." Margaret held his gaze for a long moment. "Tell me which part," she said. Her hunger or her coat or the fact that a woman had to stand in the rain and ask a banner for permission. The color left his face in stages. "Bring the chair," Margaret said. "She's my guest." That word did something to the room. Margaret felt it move through the tables like weather. "Guest." It reassigned her, and it reassigned all of them, and the woman by the door heard it and went very still, the way a person does when a door they had stopped knocking on opens. Ruth Delaney sat on the front 2 inches of the chair. She put the shoebox on the floor beside her right foot and kept her heel touching it, the way you'd keep a hand on a child in a crowd. Nobody at the table spoke. The men on either side of Margaret had built ports and container terminals, and one of them had once bought a Cézanne in a bidding war, and they sat with their hands in their laps like schoolboys. The soup came first. Ruth Delaney picked up the spoon and her hand shook so badly she set it down again. "Take your time," Margaret said. "That's the thing nobody tells you." Ruth's voice had gone quiet. "You forget how. Eating slow, I mean. You eat fast for 2 years and then somebody puts a cloth napkin in front of you and your hands don't know what to do." She tried again. The second time she managed it. Margaret watched her, and did not know yet what she was watching, and would spend the rest of her life wondering how she could have failed to know. Ruth ate half the soup and stopped. Guilty the way she'd stop at everything. I'm sorry. I'm making a scene. They're making the scene. You're eating. Something almost happened at the corner of Ruth's mouth. It didn't get all the way to a smile. Okay, how long? Margaret asked. 14 months, and before that. Ruth looked at the tablecloth. I was a hospice aide. 11 years. I was good at it. She said it flatly, without pride, the way you'd state your blood type. I worked at a facility out on the Dundalk side. Mostly nights. I liked nights. People are honest at 3 in the morning. What happened? I filed a report. Ruth turned her spoon over. There was a nurse's aide who was rough with a woman named Delphine, who was 91 and couldn't speak anymore. I wrote it up. Then I wrote it up again. Then I went to the state, and the state took 8 months, and by the time they got there Delphine had passed, and the facility settled without admitting anything, and my name went on a list. She shrugged. It was the smallest shrug Margaret had ever seen. There's no official list. Everybody just knows. Nobody in home health hires you after that. I applied to 51 places. I counted because counting felt like doing something. 51. I had a lawyer for a while, Ruth said. A settlement from the retaliation claim. Not big, enough for a deposit and a car. What happened to it? Ruth Delaney was quiet a moment. Dylan Pruitt, she said, and the name came out with edges, like she'd been carrying it in her mouth for a year and it had cut her. He handled the disbursement. He told me he'd hold it in escrow while my old job appealed. He also told me I was too smart to be wiping mouths for $14 an hour. She said the next part to the tablecloth. He was right about the money being safe, just not for me. The soup steamed. Nobody had turned the music back on. I didn't lose everything at once, Ruth said. That's the part people get wrong. They think there's a day. There isn't a day. First you lose the apartment, and you tell yourself it's temporary. Then you lose the car, and you tell yourself you're still you. Then the phone goes, and the phone was the last thing anybody could reach you at. And after that you can be standing in the middle of a sidewalk in full daylight and be completely gone. Margaret's hand found the edge of the table. I've been sleeping at the Wash and Go on Eastern, Ruth said. The one that stays open all night. Marisol runs the register on Thursdays and she pretends not to see me. That's the kindest thing anybody's done for me in a year. Somebody pretending not to see me. At the far end of the ballroom the doors to the terrace had blown partly open. Rain came in across the parquet in a thin gray sheet, and a child at table 9, some donor's granddaughter, 6 years old and losing badly at the war against her bedtime, started to cry. Ruth Delaney turned her head at the sound. It was reflexive. It was 11 years of nights. And then, so quietly that only Margaret and possibly Emiliano heard it, she began to hum. It had no words. It went up on the third note where you expected it to go down. And it hung there a moment, and it came home in a way that felt like a hand set flat on your back. Margaret Ashford stopped breathing. She knew that melody. She had heard it for the first time in the spring of 1994, coming through a bedroom door on the second floor of a house on Charnley Road, sung by a 19-year-old girl who had just found out she was pregnant and had not yet told her mother. The girl's name was Clara. The girl was Margaret's daughter. The girl had been dead for 28 years. Mrs. Ashford? Margaret looked up. Ruth Delaney had stopped humming and was watching her with an expression of pure unguarded concern. A woman who had eaten 1 bowl of soup in 3 days. Worried about the woman who had bought it. Are you all right? You've gone white. I'm fine, you're not. Ruth reached across and slid Margaret's water glass toward her. She used her left hand. She turned her wrist as she pushed it, an odd little rotation, a habit so specific that no one on earth would ever bother to imitate it. Clara had done that, with everything, forks, cups, doorknobs, a quarter turn of the wrist always since she was old enough to hold anything at all. Ma'am, Ruth said, should I get somebody? No. Margaret's voice came out from somewhere under her ribs. No, stay. She stayed. She stayed while the room slowly returned to its own noise, while the violinist recovered his nerve, while men in dinner jackets went back to talking about the harbor dredging contract, and she stayed when the plates were cleared and Margaret said, without any preamble, there's a suite on 9. It's yours tonight. You can lock it from the inside. You can leave whenever you want and nobody will stop you. Ruth Delaney's face closed like a fist. What do you want from me? It wasn't rude. It was the question of someone who had learned expensively that kindness has an invoice. Margaret could have told her the truth. I think you knew my daughter. I think you might be. No, she had no evidence. She had a melody and a wrist. She had grief that had gone unfed for 28 years and would eat anything you put in front of it. If she was wrong she would hand this woman a mother and then take her away again. Ruth Delaney had been robbed enough. I want you dry, Margaret said. That's all, just tonight. Ruth studied her for a long time. Rain moved sideways across the glass behind her. Just tonight, she said. The suite was on the 9th floor and Margaret did not sleep in her own bed that night or the next or the one after. She sat in her study with the lamp on and made calls that her name still opened. A retired administrator from Harbor Lighthouse, the shelter on Pratt where a 19-year-old girl had lived for 6 months in 1994 and 1995. A records clerk at the health department. A former investigator who, had once found a container of stolen cargo in Genoa in 9 days, and who now grew tomatoes. She had never done this before. In 28 years she had never once looked. That was the thing she kept circling in the small hours, the fact she couldn't set down. She had not looked because she had not wanted to find. Clara Ashford had been 19 when she came home, and stood in the front hall on Charnley Road with rain in her hair, and told her mother she was pregnant by a bass player named Tobias. That she was keeping the baby, and that she was not going back to Bryn Mawr. Margaret had said a number of things that night. She could recall each one with the clarity of a photograph. She had said, "You will not do this to yourself." She had said, "You have no idea what you're throwing away." She had said, "If you walk out that door you will not walk back in it." She had believed she was being strong. She had believed the door would open again within a month, because doors always had, because the world had always eventually agreed with Margaret Ashford. Clara had walked out. Clara had gone to Harbour Lighthouse. Clara had a daughter there in the spring, and 5 months after that Clara died of a pulmonary embolism in a bed on the second floor with a foghorn sounding out on the water, and by the time anyone found a number for her mother had been in Rotterdam closing on a terminal lease. Margaret had flown home. She had gone to the shelter, and a man from the family's estate office had met her there in the parking lot with a folder and had told her, gently, that the infant had also died. 3 weeks after the mother, a respiratory infection. These things happened. The paperwork was already handled, there was nothing to sign, and did Mrs. Ashford want him to arrange the burial or should the county? That man was 31 years old then. His name was Julian Sayre. He was the son of Margaret's late husband by an earlier marriage, and he had been managing the Ashford Trust documents for 4 years, and he had, on that day in the parking lot, been holding the folder against his chest with both hands. Margaret had not asked to see inside it. That was the sentence she could not get out of her body. 28 years, and it came down to 11 words. She had not asked to see inside the folder. She had been ashamed. Ashamed of her daughter, and ashamed of being ashamed, and grief had arrived with its enormous convenient hands and taken the folder away, and she had let it because looking would have meant looking at herself. On the 4th night the investigator sent a scan at 2:40 in the morning. Harbour Lighthouse intake log, October 1995. A 5-month-old female infant transferred to County Child Services following the death of the mother, not deceased, transferred. There was a line for the referring family contact, and in that line in blue ballpoint someone had written "No living relatives." Margaret sat with the laptop in her hands for a long time. Then she scrolled and found a scanned incident report from the same shelter dated August 1995. An infant had pulled a hot plate cord, a curved burn, the report said, across the left wrist. 2nd degree. Treated at Union Memorial. The attending nurse had drawn a small crescent shape in the margin, because that was what it looked like and because forms never have a box for the thing you actually saw. Margaret closed her eyes. At dinner 2 nights before, Ruth Delaney had reached for the breadbasket, and her sleeve had ridden up, and there had been a pale curved scar on the inside of her left wrist, and Margaret had noticed it and thought nothing, because she was a woman who had trained herself for 28 years to notice nothing. The doctor came to the suite on a Tuesday morning to check Ruth's blood pressure and her feet and the persistent cough she'd been dismissing. At the end he drew 2 vials of blood, and Ruth watched him do it, and then she looked at Margaret. "Is something wrong with me?" "No," Smart said. "It's routine." It was not a lie. It was, she thought afterward, a smaller and more cowardly relative of one, and she carried it around for 6 days while a lab in Rockville did what labs do. And she sat across from Ruth Delaney at breakfast every one of those mornings and memorized her. The way she apologized before asking for anything. The way she thanked housekeeping by name. The way she'd stand at the window in the afternoons and look down at Pratt Street and count something. Margaret never found out what, her lips barely moving. On the 6th day Margaret's attorney Frances Okonkwo came to the office in person. She was a woman of enormous professional calm and she did not sit down. "Margaret," she said. "Sit." Margaret took the envelope. It weighed nothing. 28 birthdays weighed nothing. She broke the seal. Probability of relationship maternal grandmother granddaughter 99-94%. She made a sound she had never made before and never made again. Frances Okonkwo came around the desk and held her while she folded forward with the paper crushed against her sternum. And outside the window the harbor cranes swung their long arms over the water. And Clara's daughter was upstairs on the 9th floor of a hotel that bore the family name, eating toast, believing she had nobody in the world. She stood outside room 914 for 2 full minutes before she knocked. Ruth opened the door in a gray sweater from the hotel shop. She'd washed her hair. Clean, she looked younger and somehow more damaged, the way a wall looks worse after you strip the paint. "Mrs. Ashford, what's wrong?" Margaret came in. The door clicked. Morning light lay across the carpet in a long yellow bar, and the breakfast tray sat untouched by the window. "Sit down," Margaret said. "Please, you're scaring me." "I know. I'm sorry." Ruth sat on the arm of the chair ready to run. "I had a daughter," Margaret said. "Her name was Clara. In 1994 she told me she was pregnant and I told her to get out of my house. Ruth's face did not move. She went to a shelter on Pratt Street, Harbor Lighthouse. She had a baby girl there in the spring of 1995. Margaret's hands would not stay still, so she stopped trying. She died that October. She was 20. I was told the baby died too. The room was so quiet Margaret could hear the elevator moving in the shaft. I never checked, she said. That's the part I need you to hear before anything else. Nobody hid it well. Nobody had to. I never checked because I was ashamed of her, and it was easier to bury a story than to go find one. Ruth's breathing had changed. When you hummed, Margaret said, at the gala. When the little girl cried. Don't, that was Clara's, she made it up. It doesn't resolve where you think it will. Don't. Margaret took out the envelope and held it in the space between them and did not move any closer. You have her wrist, she said. You have her burn. You were born in April of 1995 in a shelter 4 blocks from here, and a man who worked for my family wrote no living relatives on your intake form, and I have spent 28 years being a good person in public. Ruth Delaney took the paper. Her hands shook so badly the page rattled against itself, and she read it, and Margaret watched her read the line twice. She did not cry. That was the thing Margaret had not prepared for. She stood up very slowly, holding the report, and she looked at Margaret with a face that had gone perfectly, terribly calm. So you're the door, Ruth said. Yes, my whole life. Every foster placement, every group home, every night I sat up wondering what was wrong with me that a woman could just. Her voice broke and she gathered it back, and it was worse when she gathered it back. There was a door, and it was you, and it was closed. Yes, you didn't lose me. Ruth's mouth twisted. People keep asking me if I ever tried to find my family. Like there was some accident. She pressed the heel of her hand hard against her eye. You threw her out in the rain and then you went to Rotterdam. Margaret Ashford did not defend herself. There was, she had come to understand, nothing to defend. Yes, she said again. And Ruth Delaney sat down on the floor. Right there, in a hotel suite with a view of the water her grandmother's ships came into, and put her arms around her own knees, and made a sound like something coming apart at the seam. Margaret went to her. She was old and her knees were bad, and she got down on that carpet anyway, and she did not touch her granddaughter, because she had not earned it, and she stayed there for until Ruth's hand came out blindly and found her sleeve and held on. I'm here, Margaret said. It sounded absurd and inadequate, and 28 years late. She said it anyway. I'm here now. I don't forgive you, Ruth said into her arms. I know. I'm not being cruel, I just, Ruth. Margaret's throat was closing. You don't owe me forgiveness, you never will. Not one day of it. You can hate me from the room next door for the rest of my life, and I will still get up every morning and be glad you're in it. The shoebox sat by the chair leg where it always sat. Ruth reached over and pulled it into her lap and held it, and she cried the way people cry when they have finally reached a place they are allowed to stop being strong. Later, much later, when she could speak, Margaret asked what was in the box. Ruth untied the twine. Inside were letters, 40 or 50 of them, some on hospital notepaper, some on the backs of pharmacy receipts, one on a napkin. They were addressed to other people. Dear Mama. Dear Ray. To whoever reads this after. They're from my patients, Ruth said. Hospice, the ones nobody came for. They'd dictate a letter to somebody who was never going to answer, and I'd write it down, and then they'd die and there was nowhere to send it. She smoothed one with her thumb. So I kept them. I know it's strange. Margaret looked at the box. Nobody ever wrote one to you, she said. Ruth's chin went up. No. 2 blocks away, in a coffee shop with a cracked window, Dylan Pruitt was scrolling a local gossip page and just stopped scrolling. The photo was blurry, shot through a hotel lobby's glass from across the street, but he knew the woman in the gray sweater. He knew the set of her shoulders. He knew the small scar on her wrist because he had once held that wrist and told her she deserved better than the life she had. The caption said, Shipping heiress Margaret Ashford seen with unidentified woman. Sources say family. Dylan Pruitt read the word family 4 times. Then he made a call, and the call went to an office on the 31st floor of a building Margaret Ashford owned, where a man named Julian Sayre listened without interrupting for 4.5 minutes, and then stood up and closed his door. Tell me exactly what you know, Julian Sayre said. Julian Sayre was 59. He had been chief operating officer of Ashford Maritime for 19 years, and a trustee of the family holdings for 32, and he had spent those 32 years living in the specific comfort of a man who knows that when the old woman dies, the trust passes to the trustee for administration in the absence of lineal descent. In the absence of lineal descent. 9 words in a document nobody read. In October of 1995 he had driven to Harbor Lighthouse with a folder and a plan that had taken him roughly 90 minutes to devise, and it had worked because it had cost nothing and required nothing except a grieving woman's willingness not to look. He had written no living relatives in his own hand. He had never even needed to forge a death certificate. He had simply said it, out loud in a parking lot, and Margaret Ashford had believed him because she wanted to. The first attack came in a cream-colored envelope with no return address. It said Ruth Delaney had known who Margaret was before she came to that gala. It said Dylan Pruitt had coached her. The scrub top, the shoebox, the rain, all of it staged. It said she had practiced the story about the shelter. It said blood proves nothing about love. The last line said, "She found you because you are rich, not because you are hers." Margaret folded the letter before Ruth could see it. She was too slow. "Is it about me?" "It's about somebody who is frightened," Margaret said. 2 days later there was audio. It arrived from a burner number. 22 seconds. A hotel lobby, a woman's voice. Ruth's cadence, Ruth's low register. Gat, she got on the letter S. "She's lonely and she's old. If I do this right I never sleep outside again." Ruth heard it and went the color of paper. "That is not me." "I know," Margaret said. "You don't, you can't. That's my voice. Ruth, look at me, I know." She did not know, not the way she said it. She knew the way you know when you have decided, finally and permanently, which side of a door you intend to stand on. She hired Dr. Wendell Ives, a forensic audio examiner from Silver Spring who had testified in 11 federal cases and who wore the same brown cardigan to all of them. He took the file. He took 9 days. He came back with a printout and a small speaker and a manner of profound irritation. "It's competent," he said. "It's not good. Whoever built it fed a synthesizer maybe 40 seconds of her real voice, a voicemail probably years old. The format's drift. Here," he tapped. "And here, that's not enough," Francis Okonkwo said. "No," Dr. Ives agreed. "This is 22 seconds of a woman ruining her own life in a lobby at night. The metadata says this was recorded the night of December 23 at 9:40 p.m. in the lobby of the Ashford Grand now. That night in this city it rained 1 3/10 inches. The lobby has a revolving door and 2 service entrances and 180 feet of single-pane glass on the Pratt Street side." He let it play again. "Where's the rain?" he said. Nobody spoke. "There's no rain," Dr. Ives said. "There's no HVAC. There's no elevator chime. There's no room. It was made somewhere quiet by somebody who thought a voice was the only thing that had to be true." By then Julian Sayre had produced a witness. Her name was Odette Frayne. She was 71, and she said she had been a floor supervisor at Harbor Lighthouse from 1993 to 1998, and she sat in a conference room on the 22nd floor with her hands folded and her voice full of sorrowful reluctance. "I don't like saying this," she said, "but that girl was always working an angle. Even as a child, she'd cry on cue. She used to say she was going to find herself a rich family someday." Through the glass partition in the hallway, Ruth Delaney stood absolutely still and heard every word, and for a moment she was 8 years old and standing at a window in October. Margaret watched her granddaughter's face. Then she turned back to Odette Frayne and rested her folded hands on the table. "Mrs. Frayne," she said. "You work nights?" "Many of them." "Then help me." There was a sound out on the water. It went off in the fog sometimes for hours. The little ones would wake up crying because of it and the night staff would have to walk them. Margaret tilted her head. "What was it?" Odette Frayne blinked. The traffic," she said. "It's a busy street." The room went very quiet. "It was the foghorn," Margaret said. "On the Lazaretto Point light. It ran every 20 seconds, November through March, until they decommissioned it in 2001. Every woman who ever slept a winter in that building could tell you that in her sleep. My daughter wrote about it in a letter I never opened until 9 days ago." Odette Frayne's mouth opened. "You have never set foot in Harbor Lighthouse," Margaret said. "Who paid you?" The old woman looked at the door. She looked at Francis Okonkwo, who had not moved. She looked, finally, at the recorder on the table, and something in her collapsed inward, and what came out of her mouth then took the state's attorney's office 4 months to fully unbraid. Margaret walked out into the hallway. Ruth was standing with her back against the glacis, breathing too fast. "They'll keep going," Ruth said. "They'll keep lying until one of them sticks. And one day you'll be sitting across from me at breakfast and you'll wonder." Margaret took her by both hands. She had to reach up to do it. "Listen to me," she said. 28 years ago a man handed me a folder and told me a story, and I did not open the folder because opening it would have cost me something I wasn't willing to pay." Her voice was not steady. She let it not be steady. "I have paid it now. I have paid it with everything. I will never again decide what is true by finding out what is comfortable." Ruth's eyes came up. "They can send me 100 tapes," Margaret said. "I know what a foghorn sounds like now." The trial of Julian Sayre took 11 days. He wore gray. He never once looked at Ruth Delaney, who sat in the second row with a cardboard shoebox on her knees. Because his attorneys had told him not to and because he understood, in a way he could not have articulated, that if he looked at her he would see his own arithmetic staring back. Odette Frayne testified for the state, and cried, and was not believed about the crying and was believed about everything else. A junior associate from the estate office produced the original 1995 intake carbon, which had been in a box in a storage facility in Curtis Bay for 26 years because nobody, including Julian Sayre, had ever imagined anyone would look. Dr. Wendell Ives explained rain to a jury for 40 minutes. Dylan Pruitt took a plea and testified in a suit that did not fit him. He got 7 years for wire fraud and conversion of client funds, and on his way out of the courtroom he turned toward Ruth and said, "I'm sorry," and she looked at him the way you look at weather. Julian Sayre was convicted on 9 counts. Falsification of vital records, concealment of a material fact from a trust beneficiary, conspiracy, fabrication of evidence. The judge, an unhurried woman with reading glasses pushed up into her hair, spoke for 6 minutes before she said the number. 22 years, she said it slowly. She said that in her 31 years on the bench, she had rarely encountered a crime whose damage was so easy to measure, because the defendant had stolen a specific countable thing. He had stolen a childhood, and a mother and a grandmother, and he had known the exact price of each when he took them. The marshals moved in. Julian Sayre stood and turned, and finally, at the last possible second, when there was nothing left in it for him, he looked back over his shoulder at Margaret Ashford. She was already reaching for her coat. Warren Croft was terminated the week after the gala. He did not sue. He gave one interview which he later regretted, in which he used the phrase protecting the atmosphere. 91 days later, at the Foundation's meal program on Fayette Street, a volunteer coordinator named Desan Kemelu called Margaret and said, in a voice carefully drained of opinion, "There's a man here who filled out an application. I think you'll want to know his name." Margaret sat with the phone against her ear for a while. "Does he want to be seen doing it?" "He asked to work in the dish pit," Dessa said. "Says he doesn't want to be on the floor." Margaret looked out at the harbor. "Give him the dish pit," she said. "And Dessa, don't be warm to him, just be fair. He'll find warmth harder to survive. He is there still. He does not tell people who he was. He is, by every account, extremely good at the dish pit. And once a week he stays late to break down the cardboard. And nobody has ever photographed him doing it, which Margaret suspects is the only part of his penance that is actually working." The following December, on the 23rd, it rained again. They did not hold the gala at the Ashford Grand. They held it in the ballroom of the old customs house, with the doors open to the street, and there was no banner, because Ruth had asked that there be no banner, and there was no beef tenderloin, because there was a buffet, and the buffet was open to anybody who came through the door, and 41 people did who had not been invited, and every one of them was fed. Emiliano ran the kitchen line. He is 24 now, and going to school on a scholarship the Foundation does not publicize, and he still cannot throw away food without flinching. Margaret sat in the third row. She had not sat at table 1 in a year and did not miss it. Ruth Delaney walked to the microphone in a plain dark dress. She had gained 11 pounds. She was at that point 4 months into a nursing program at the community college, and she had not accepted a single dollar of the trust, and the argument about that was ongoing and would remain ongoing for years, and was, Margaret thought, the healthiest thing in her life. Ruth set the shoebox on the podium. She untied the twine. "My mother's name was Clara Ashford," she said. "She was 20 years old. She lived 4 blocks from here, in a building that isn't there anymore, and she died in the winter, and for 28 years nobody said her name out loud in a room this size." 300 people listened. Some of them had laughed once, in a doorway. "I'm not going to tell you she was a saint," Ruth said. "I never met her. I'm going to tell you she was 19 and scared and somebody's daughter, and that on the night she needed a door to open, it didn't." She lifted a letter out of the box. "I used to write these for people who were dying alone," she said. "Nobody ever wrote one for me. So last month I sat down and wrote one myself, and I'm going to read it, and then I'm going to put it in this box with the rest of them, because that's where the ones that never got sent go." She unfolded it. Her hands did not shake. "Dear Ruth," she read, "you were not thrown away. You were dropped, by people who were too proud to bend down. That is not the same thing, and it is not your fault, and it took you 29 years to learn it, and I am sorry it took so long." She stopped. She looked out at the room, and she found in the third row an old woman in a gray coat who was making no effort at all to hide her face. "P.S. Ruth read. "Somebody did bend down. Late. But she did." Margaret Ashford does not tell this story often, and when she does she tells it badly, because she has never learned how to say the part about the folder without stopping in the middle. She is 71 now. On Thursdays she drives herself to the Wash and Go on Eastern Avenue, and buys the coffee and sits with a woman named Marisol Betancourt, who once pretended not to see a person sleeping in the back, and who has never once accepted a check from the Foundation and never will. And sometimes on the way home Margaret passes somebody on the corner with a sign, and she stops the car and she gets out. Because she has learned the one thing that 11 years of galas and 18-inch gold letters could not teach her. Every person sleeping on Seaside Sock is standing outside of the Mercy decided to close. The mercy is not in the meal. The mercy is in going back to the door.